Before empires, before armies, a boy's oath sworn in fire and shadow. A curse that would echo across seas and bring a world power to its knees. That boy was Hannibal Barca, and the vow was not his alone, but his father's, the great Hamilcar, a lion of Carthage, forced to kneel. He had not been defeated on the battlefield, but in the gilded halls of his own city, by senators who chose comfortable peace over costly victory. So they left for Iberia, a land of jagged mountains and silver-rich rivers, a self-imposed exile. There, under a foreign sun, Hamilcar built a new kingdom, a private army fueled by Iberian silver and a singular, burning purpose. He was preparing not for wealth, but for a war he knew was inevitable. It was on this anvil of ambition that the sun was tempered. Hannibal learned the art of command, not from scrolls, but in the dust of the march, the chaos of the skirmish. He learned the language of a dozen tribes, the secrets of the land, and the unspoken language of a soldier's loyalty. Then the foundation of this new power shattered. Hamilcar fell in a minor battle, a giant brought down by an anonymous spear. The news reached Hannibal not as a cry of despair, but as a silent, cold transfer of weight. The mantle of the oath and the army now fell upon his young shoulders. He was 26, a mere youth by the measure of the senators in Carthage, but his eyes held the stillness of a man who had already lived 100 campaigns. The army, hardened veterans all, looked upon him, and they saw not the son, but the father's spirit, refined and sharpened to a deadlier point. Carthage itself was a city of two souls. One, the soul of the merchant, pragmatic, wealthy, its harbors thick with the scents of spice and papyrus. The other, the soul of the ancient Phoenician sailor, daring, relentless, willing to sail beyond the edges of the known world. Hannibal was the embodiment of the latter, and Rome watched. Across the wine-dark sea, the Republic saw the Barcid power growing in Iberia. They saw the silver, the armies, the unbroken line of defiance. A treaty was signed, then broken. A line was drawn in the sand, then crossed. Each act was a move in a game both sides knew could only end in ashes. The spark came from a small, fortified town on the coast of Iberia Saguntum, a Roman ally, a test of wills. Hannibal laid siege. It was not a strategic necessity, but a message, a declaration. The senators in Carthage received his words, and a chill must have gripped them. Their general had chosen the path of total war. The siege was brutal, a foretaste of the horrors to come. When the walls finally fell, the message was clear for any in Rome who could read it. This was not a border dispute. It was the opening move in a vendetta that would consume nations. The oath sworn in a temple was now marching inexorably towards its fulfillment. Winter was coming, but Hannibal's mind was already crossing the impossible barrier of the Alps, while Roman legions mobilized. Expecting a conventional sea-borne invasion, he conceived of a strike from the roof of the world itself, a descent into Italy not as an invader, but as an apparition. In the spring he moved, an army of 60,000 men, 12,000 horses, and 37 elephants, a living, breathing city on the march. They left New Carthage, a river of steel and flesh flowing north, its current pulling them toward a destiny that would etch their names into eternity. The Pyrenees were the first test, not a military one, but a test of faith. Tribes ambushed them. Men whispered of omens. Hannibal did not flinch. He pressed on, leaving behind the faint of heart, forging a smaller, harder, more devoted army with every league they traveled from home. Then the Rhine, a wide, powerful river, a liquid wall guarded by hostile Gallic tribes. While the chieftains gathered on the far bank, laughing at the impossibility of the crossing, Hannibal's engineers worked through the night. They built rafts, they hollowed logs. They would not be stopped. The crossing was a masterpiece of misdirection. As the main force made its way across the churning waters, Hannibal sent a detachment miles upstream. They fell upon the Gauls from behind, a surprise attack that turned their triumphant jeers into screams of panic. The river was won. But now the true test loomed, a sight that made the hardest veteran catch his breath. Before them, scraping the underbelly of the sky, stood the Alps. Their peaks were shrouded in perpetual snow, a fortress built by gods, white, silent, and utterly merciless. The mountain tribes, the Allobroges, watched from the heights. They were masters of this vertical world, and they saw the invaders not as an army, but as prey. Rock slides were triggered. Ambushes sprung from the mist. The path was a narrow ledge of terror, with a sheer drop into oblivion. The cold was a blade that stole into the bone. Men who had survived a dozen battles slipped on ice and vanished without a sound. The elephants, those living siege towers, became fragile, their great feet struggling for purchase on the glassy stone. The army was being honed away, not by sword, but by the wind. At the highest pass, Hannibal gathered his freezing, exhausted men. He pointed not down, but forward into the hazy, green expanse of Italy. "You are now climbing the wall, not only of Italy, but of Rome itself," he told them. The land of their enemy lay at their feet, a prize worth every agony. The descent was, in its way, more terrible than the climb. The path was treacherous, a sheet of new ice over old snow. They built roads in a day, cutting through rock to save the animals. After 15 days in the realm of death, the first scouts touched the green grass of the Po Valley. Of the 60,000 who began the march, barely half remained. But they were here. The air itself had changed. It was softer, warmer, heavy with the scent of earth and life after the killing cold of the peaks. But this land was not empty. It was the homeland of the Gauls, tribes simmering with a hatred for Rome. They saw in this phantom army a spark for their own rebellion. News of the descent from the Alps struck Rome like a physical blow. The Senate, which had expected to fight a war on foreign shores, now found the enemy at its doorstep. Consuls scrambled. Legions meant for Africa were rerouted north. The impossible had happened, and fear, cold and sharp, seeped into the heart of the Republic. The first blood was drawn at the Ticinus River, a cavalry skirmish. It was not a great battle, but a probe, a testing of blades. Hannibal's Numidian horsemen, fluid as quicksilver, swarmed the heavier Roman cavalry. The Romans recoiled, their commander, Scipio the Elder, wounded, saved by his own son. That son would one day become the shadow that mirrored Hannibal. But for now, he was just a boy, witnessing the old ways of war fail. The defeat was a whisper, a warning the Romans did not fully heed. They believed their legion, a wall of shields and discipline, was invincible in a pitched battle. Confident, the main Roman force pursued Hannibal to the Trebia River. It was winter. The ground was frozen, the air biting. The Romans, hungry and cold, waded across the chest-high, icy waters to meet him on the chosen field. They believed they were the hunters. Hannibal had prepared the ground. His men had eaten, had been warmed by fires. He hid his brother Mago and an elite force in the rush of a nearby stream. As the two main lines clashed, as the Roman discipline pressed forward, this hidden force rose from the earth itself. The battle became a slaughter. Trapped, half-frozen, and surrounded, the Roman army was methodically cut to pieces. The river ran red behind them, blocking their retreat. It was a complete, devastating victory. The myth of Roman invincibility was shattered on that frozen plain. Hannibal, now master of northern Italy, did not march on Rome. It was a decision that would be debated for millennia. Instead, he moved to consolidate, to win over the Italian tribes. He sought not just to defeat Rome's army, but to break its confederation, to unravel its empire from within. He released his Italian prisoners without ransom, telling them he had come not to fight them, but to liberate them from Rome. The message was a weapon. It traveled ahead of his army, sowing doubt and rebellion in the hearts of Rome's subjects. The war was now one of ideas. The following spring, he forced a march through the treacherous, flooded marshes of the Arno. For days his army trudged through putrid water, without sleep, without dry ground. Hannibal himself, riding the last surviving war elephant, lost the sight in one eye to a raging infection. The price of his campaign was etched onto his very face. Emerging from the swamps, he offered the Romans battle again. He lured the new consul Flaminius, a man of pride and impatience, into a perfect killing ground. The place was Lake Trasimene, a narrow road squeezed between hills and the water, shrouded in a thick morning mist. Flaminius, confident in his pursuit, led his entire army into the defile. He could not see the hillsides. He could not see the thousands of Carthaginian soldiers, waiting in absolute silence, their weapons ready, their breath held. The mist was Hannibal's greatest ally. At Hannibal's signal, a single horn cried out. Then the world erupted. From three sides, the Carthaginians descended through the fog. The Romans, trapped in a narrow space, had no room to form their battle lines. It was not a battle. It was a massacre in the mist. The fighting was intimate, brutal, and confused. Men fought and died in the whiteness, often killing their own in the panic. Consul Flaminius was cut down, his body lost in the carnage. 15,000 Romans perished that morning, their blood staining the lakeshore and the reeds. When the mist finally burned away under the midday sun, it revealed a scene from a nightmare. The lake was littered with bodies and broken equipment. The scale of the disaster was absolute. In Rome, the news brought pure terror. The city prepared for a siege that seemed inevitable. Again, Hannibal did not march on Rome. He moved to the south, continuing his strategy of dismantling the Italian Confederation. He was a surgeon, carefully severing the arteries that fed the Roman heart. But with each victory, his own army, a patchwork of Carthaginians, Gauls, and Africans, grew harder to control. In Rome, despair gave way to grim resolution. They appointed a dictator, Fabius Maximus. His strategy was maddening, un-Roman. He would shadow Hannibal's army, harass its foragers, but never offer pitched battle. He was called the Delayer, and his caution was seen as cowardice. Fabius understood what others did not. He was fighting a phantom. To engage Hannibal on his terms was to die. His strategy was to let the land itself fight for Rome, to let Hannibal's army, so far from home, slowly wither on the vine. It was a war of patience against genius. For a year, this shadowboxing continued. Hannibal could not force a decisive battle. Fabius would not grant one. The frustration in Rome grew. The merchants and senators, eager for a quick end to the war that was ruining their estates, demanded a return to the old, proud ways of combat. The following year, the strategy of Fabius was abandoned. The Romans raised the largest army in their history, 8 legions. Their new consuls, Varro and Paulus, were given a single command: find Hannibal, crush him, and end this nightmare. The stage was set for the most infamous day in Roman history. Hannibal, with deliberate cunning, seized a vital Roman supply depot at Cannae. It was more than a logistical coup. It was a calculated insult, a gauntlet thrown before the massive new consular army. He knew pride would now do his work for him. The Roman host, a bristling forest of spears and shields, found him on the arid plains near the Aufidus River. They outnumbered him almost 2 to 1. Confidence ran high in the Roman ranks. This time, there would be no mist, no tricky ambushes. Just raw, brutal force. Hannibal arranged his army with deceptive simplicity. His center, formed of Gallic and Iberian infantry, was convex, a shallow arc bulging towards the Romans. His flanks were held by his hardened Libyan veterans, and on the far wings, his cavalry, the true key to the day, waited. He positioned himself with the center, the point of greatest danger. The wind, hot and dusty, blew against his face. He gave a final silent prayer to the gods of his fathers, then ordered the advance. The great killing machine of Rome began to march forward, its tread shaking the earth. The battle opened with the cavalry. On the left, his Iberian and Gallic horse shattered the Roman cavalry. On the right, his peerless Numidians pinned and then routed the Italian allies. The Roman army, mighty and immense, was now blind on both sides. Then the legion struck his center, just as he had planned. The Gauls and Iberians fought with desperate bravery, but the pressure was immense. Slowly, giving ground at a terrible cost, the convex line began to bend inwards. It became a concave pocket. The Romans, smelling victory, pushed deeper into the pocket. Their ranks compressed, their discipline dissolving into a pressing mob. They could no longer swing their swords. They were packed together, breathless, trapped by their own success and the press of their comrades from behind. At that precise moment, the victorious Carthaginian cavalry returned. They fell upon the rear of the Roman mass. Simultaneously, the Libyan veterans on the flanks turned inward. They struck the compressed Roman sides like twin hammers on an anvil. The battle was over. What remained was butchery. The Roman army, surrounded and unable to fight, was systematically annihilated. The consul Paulus died. Perhaps 50,000 men, the flower of Roman manhood, fell in a single afternoon on a field no larger than a few square miles. That night, on the field of Cannae, Hannibal stood at the peak of his power. He had achieved the unthinkable. Maharbal, his cavalry commander, is said to have urged him to march on Rome at once. In 5 days, he promised, you will feast on the capital. But Hannibal hesitated. The moment, the perfect, fleeting moment, passed into history. The news of Cannae broke Rome, but it did not break her spirit. There was panic in the streets, but in the Senate, a steely resolve took hold. They forbade public mourning. They raised new legions from boys and old men. They would never, ever surrender. The war had become existential. Hannibal's great victory yielded less than he had hoped. The Italian allies, shocked by Cannae, did not defect en masse. The core of the Roman Confederation held. He was a master of the battlefield, but he was slowly losing the strategic war. He was a lion surrounded by a pack of wolves that refused to die. The years after Cannae became a grim stalemate. Hannibal marched through Italy, a king without a crown, but he could not be everywhere. The Romans, having learned their lesson, returned to the strategy of Fabius. They avoided battle, while recapturing rebellious cities with relentless cruelty. His pleas for reinforcements from Carthage were met with delay and half-measures. The merchant lords of the city, comfortable in their wealth, did not share his consuming vision. They sent just enough to keep hope alive, but never enough to win the war. The ocean between them became a chasm of misunderstanding. Meanwhile, a new Roman strategy emerged. While containing Hannibal in Italy, they would take the war to his source. A young, audacious general, the same Scipio who had saved his father at the Ticinus, was given command in Iberia. His mission: cut Hannibal's lifeline. In a series of brilliant campaigns, Scipio captured Carthago Nova, the Barcid capital in Iberia. He secured vast silver mines and, crucially, the goodwill of the local tribes. One by one, Hannibal's brothers were defeated and killed. The Iberian pillar of Barcid power crumbled into dust. After 15 years on Italian soil, Hannibal was recalled. A Roman army under Scipio had landed in Africa itself. Carthage was in peril. The recall was not a homecoming, but a desperate summons to save his city from the very fate he had intended for Rome. He left Italy as he had found it, still wrong. He had won every major battle, but he was leaving without victory. The land was scarred by his passage, but its heart still beat for the Republic. The oath was unfulfilled. The fire of his youth had burned down to embers. He returned to a Carthage he barely recognized, and which barely recognized him. He was a legend, but also a reminder of a devastating war they now wished to end. He raised a new army, but it was not the veteran instrument he had forged in Italy. It was the last, hastily gathered hope of a wounded nation. The two titans, whose destinies had been intertwined since childhood, would finally meet. At Zama, deep in the African heartland, Hannibal and Scipio faced each other across the dust. The master of improvisation against the master of preparation. The past of war against its future. The plains of Zama were vast, open, and offered no tricks. Here there would be no ambush, no clever terrain. It was a field chosen for a final pure test of arms. Scipio had studied his enemy, learned his patterns. He came prepared not to outsmart the master, but to break his method. Hannibal arrayed his army in 3 distinct lines. The first was a screen of mercenaries. The second, a line of newer Carthaginian and Libyan levies. The third, and most formidable, were his own Italian veterans, the hardened survivors of Cannae and Trasimene, held in reserve as his final crushing blow. He placed 80 elephants at the very front, a terrifying force meant to shatter the Roman lines before they even met. But these were not the trained beasts of the Alps. They were young, untested, and skittish. The ground trembled as they shuffled, a sound meant to herald doom. Scipio did not form a solid line. Instead, he arranged his maniples in vertical columns, with clear, inviting lanes between them. It was an unorthodox, risky formation. As the elephants charged, the Roman trumpets blared, creating a wall of sound that panicked the great beasts. Confused and wounded, many elephants turned and rampaged back through their own lines, causing chaos in Hannibal's cavalry wings. In that moment of disorder, Scipio's own cavalry, now superior in both number and quality, charged and routed the Carthaginian horse from the field. The infantry lines then met with a sound like the cracking of the world. The first 2 lines of Hannibal's army were ground down by the relentless, flexible advance of the Roman maniples. But they fought hard, forcing the legions to expend their energy before the real test. As the last of the second line broke, a sight to freeze the blood of any Roman veteran appeared. There, silent and immovable, stood Hannibal's veterans of Italy. They had not flinched. They had not advanced. They stood in perfect order, a wall of scarred flesh and grim resolve, resting while their comrades died. Scipio, a master of psychology, did not press a tired attack. He did something extraordinary. He recalled his forward legions and reformed his entire battle line into a single fresh front facing Hannibal's veterans. It was a moment of breathtaking control on a chaotic battlefield. The final clash was not one of clever tactics, but of sheer, brutal will. The 2 best armies in the world, led by its 2 greatest generals, met head-on. The noise was deafening, the fighting desperate. For a long time, it seemed the veterans of Italy might yet prevail through sheer grit. But the battle was decided by an absence, and then a presence. The Carthaginian cavalry, which had fled, did not return. The Roman cavalry, which had pursued, now did. They fell upon the rear of Hannibal's veterans. At Cannae, Hannibal had perfected the encirclement. At Zama, he became its victim. The Carthaginian line, surrounded and attacked from all sides, dissolved. It was not a rout, but a final, agonizing collapse. The dream that had begun with an oath in a temple died there, on the dusty plain of Zama, in the silence that followed the last cry of war. Hannibal himself fought in the fray, a general until the end. He managed to cut his way out of the encirclement with a handful of his most loyal men. He rode away from the field, from his army, from his life's work. He was a fugitive in his own homeland. Carthage had no choice. The gates were open to Scipio's terms. The treaty was merciless. They lost all their elephants, all but a handful of warships. They were forbidden to wage war outside Africa, and only with Rome's permission within it. An indemnity of 10,000 talents of silver was imposed, a crushing debt for generations. Hannibal, surprisingly, was not executed or handed over. For a time, he tried to rebuild Carthage, not as a military power, but as a commercial and political one. He fought corruption, reformed the state's finances. But his very presence was a threat to Rome, a ghost they could not abide. Rome demanded his surrender. The man who had been their nightmare for 2 decades was now a political pawn. To save his city from further reprisals, Hannibal chose a final exile. He slipped away by sea, a man without a country, forever hunted by the long shadow of the eagles. His wanderings became a legend in themselves. He found refuge in the courts of Eastern kings, serving as a military advisor, always one step ahead of Roman assassins. He was a living lesson in war, a trophy that Rome was desperate to capture, a ghost that haunted their expansion. Years turned into decades. Carthage, stripped of its empire, prospered once more through trade alone. Its merchants grew rich again. But in Rome, every shipment of African grain, every new Carthaginian merchant vessel, was seen not as commerce, but as a resurgence. The fear and hatred born at Trebia and Cannae festered. The old vengeful Cato the Elder rose in the Roman Senate. He ended every speech, regardless of the topic, with the same grim phrase, Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. It was no longer a policy. It was a mantra of annihilation, repeated until it became the will of the state. They found their pretext in a technical breach of the treaty. Carthage, defending itself against a Numidian king, a Roman ally, had raised an army without Rome's permission. It was a desperate act of self-defense, but Rome declared it an act of war. The final Third Punic War had begun. Its objective was not victory, but eradication. As the Roman legions landed in Africa, the Carthaginians, in a final, gut-wrenching act of submission, agreed to every Roman demand. They handed over their weapons, their armor, their siege engines. They watched as a mountain of their means of defense was piled before the city walls. They were now utterly naked before their executioner. But Rome's final demand was a sentence of death. The city must be abandoned, its people moved inland. To a people whose soul was the sea, whose identity was their harbor, this was an impossibility. The despair turned to a wild, cornered fury. They would fight with nothing but their hands and their will. The city became a forge of desperation. Temples became workshops. Sacred groves were felled for timber. Day and night, the hammers rang, not crafting fine silver, but spears and swords of inferior metal. Women cut their hair to make torsion for new catapults. A civilization was arming itself for its own funeral pyre. The siege began. The Romans, under Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of Hannibal's vanquisher, built immense walls to blockade the city. But Carthage was not an easy prey. Its walls were mighty, its people united by the certainty of their doom. They repelled assault after assault. For 3 years, the siege dragged on, a testament to human tenacity. The Carthaginians, starving, diseased, invented new horrors of war, hurling pots of venomous snakes into the Roman trenches. They fought for every street, every house, every stone of their ancestral home. Finally, the Romans broke through the harbor wall. The final battle was not on a field, but in the city itself, a descent into a labyrinth of death. It was a war of rooftops and cellars, a slow, grinding advance measured in blood and fire. The city shrank, street by street, toward the ancient citadel of Byrrhassa. The last defenders, a remnant of the once great army, made their stand in the temple of Eshmon. They knew there was no surrender, no terms, only a choice of how to die. The final commander of Carthage, a general named Hasdrubal, was not made of the same metal as Hannibal. As the end neared, he fled his post, begging for mercy from Scipio. His surrender was granted, a final humiliation for the city he abandoned. But his wife, who had watched his capitulation from the temple, did not share his desire for life. She dressed in her finest robes, as for a festival. Then, after cursing her husband for his cowardice, she took her 2 children, walked into the heart of the burning temple, and threw herself and them into the flames. With her death, the organized resistance of Carthage ended. What followed was not a battle, but a slaughter. For 6 days, the Romans systematically killed, enslaved, and plundered. The streets ran with blood and the echoes of a dying world. Scipio Aemilianus, the victor, watched the final conflagration. He did not cheer. He wept. Reciting lines from Homer about the fall of Troy, he turned to his friend and said, "It is a glorious moment. But I have a terrible fear that someday someone will give the same order about my own homeland." The city burned for 17 days. Then, by order of the Senate, a plow was drawn over the site, and salt was sown into the furrows, a curse of eternal barrenness upon the land. Carthage was to be made a ghost, its memory and its very soil anathema. Of Hannibal, the ghost that had started it all, the end came years before, in a small borrowed villa in Bithynia. Surrounded by Roman agents, he had finally run out of world to flee to. He chose his own exit, taking poison from a ring he had carried for such a purpose. His final words were said to be, "Let us now relieve the Romans of their long anxiety, since they think it too long to wait for the death of an old man." The irony was perfect. In death, as in life, he remained one step ahead, denying them the satisfaction of his capture. The legacy of Carthage did not vanish with its stones. Its libraries, its knowledge of navigation, its vast mercantile networks were absorbed by the Roman world that had destroyed it. Rome became the heir to everything Carthage had been, except its spirit. The fall of Carthage left Rome without a rival in the Mediterranean. But this unchallenged power corrupted the Republic from within. The vast wealth, the endless slaves, the taste for absolute destruction, planted the seeds of the civil wars and the imperial tyranny to come. And what of the oath? The boy's vow in the temple that set the world aflame? It was fulfilled, but in a way none could have foreseen. Carthage did not fall to Hamilcar's son on the capital, but by the hand of another Scipio, over the ashes of its own temples. The gods had answered with a terrible literal precision. Today, the site of Carthage is a quiet suburb, a place of scattered stones and whispers. The salt did not take. Life returned. But the memory of the fire remains, a haunting in the Mediterranean mind, a caution that no power, however great, is eternal. Hannibal's story is not one of failure, but of a magnitude of ambition so vast that its collapse reshaped the world. He demonstrated that the seemingly unbreakable can be broken, that the greatest power can be brought to the brink. He was the shadow against which Rome defined its own light. The fall of Carthage teaches a somber lesson about the nature of fear. It was not Carthage's strength that doomed it, but Rome's memory of that strength. The terror of Hannibal, long after his death, demanded a finality so complete it became a self-fulfilling prophecy of annihilation. In the end, the story of Carthage is the story of the oath, the elephant, the Alpine pass, the perfect battle, and the long, slow dying of the light. It is a whisper on the wind from a city of ghosts, a reminder that all nations, all empires, carry within them the seeds of their own fall, waiting for the right season to sprout. In the silent aftermath, the victors wrote the history. Carthage was painted as a monster of greed and cruelty, its rituals distorted into tales of child sacrifice and boundless malice. The complex, brilliant civilization was reduced to a caricature, a moral lesson on the fate of Rome's enemies. Yet the ghost of Hannibal lingered in the Roman military psyche. For centuries, every Roman general measured himself against the Carthaginian. His strategies became textbooks, his marshes the stuff of officer training. He was the eternal adversary, the standard of military genius against which all others were found wanting. The wealth plundered from Carthage flooded Rome, accelerating its transformation. The simple, austere republic that had faced Hannibal began to crumble under the weight of its own new riches. The very victory that secured its power began to corrode the virtues that had made it possible. And what of the land itself? The curse of salt was a powerful symbol, but life is tenacious. Years later, Roman colonists would settle on the very same site, building their own city over the ashes. They walked on the bones of a civilization they had erased, unaware of the irony beneath their feet. The memory of the Carthaginian people did not vanish entirely. In the mountains of North Africa, in isolated villages, their language, their Punic tongue, was still whispered for generations. A quiet, stubborn act of cultural survival against the tide of Romanization. The Roman fear of a Carthaginian resurgence became a self-fulfilling prophecy of a different kind. Their ruthless policy created a power vacuum, a bitterness that would centuries later fuel other empires, other conflicts on African soil. The seeds of future wars were sown with the salt. Scipio Aemilianus, the destroyer of Carthage, returned to a Rome that was already turning in on itself. The political violence of the Gracchi brothers, the social wars, the rise of the generals all were legacies of a world without counterbalance, a republic unmoored by its own supreme power. The story of Hannibal and Carthage entered the realm of myth and tragedy. He became an archetype, the noble doomed adversary, the man who challenged fate itself and almost won. His failure was more glorious than most victories, his name forever synonymous with brilliant, catastrophic ambition. Modern archaeology has begun to sift the layers of ash and propaganda. The real Carthage emerges not a monster, but a sophisticated, cosmopolitan hub of art, science, and commerce. Its story is being reclaimed from the victor's narrative, piece by painstaking piece. The fall of Carthage poses an eternal question. Does absolute security require the absolute destruction of a rival? Or does such an act merely create a different, more insidious form of insecurity? A moral and political vacuum that ultimately consumes the victor from within. The death of a civilization is not a single event, but a cascade. With Carthage, the knowledge of trans-Saharan trade routes faded. Unique artistic styles were lost. A distinct voice in the chorus of human history was silenced, leaving the melody permanently impoverished. For the Romans who fought there, the siege left a permanent mark. They had witnessed a level of civilian resistance and sacrifice that haunted them. The phrase Punic faith, once a slur for treachery, now carried a darker, more respectful connotation of desperate, fatal loyalty. The political fallout in Rome was immediate. The immense wealth concentrated in the hands of a few senators from the spoils exacerbated class divisions. The populist reforms of the Gracchi brothers were a direct response to this new inequality, a civil war born from the ashes of a foreign one. In a final, cruel twist of fate, the descendants of the very legions that destroyed Carthage would, centuries later, see their own capital, Rome, sacked by Vandals who had established a kingdom in North Africa. The wheel of fortune had turned full circle. The land where Carthage stood never forgot its blood. Even today, during excavations, the soil reveals its tragic layers. Blackened strata from the Great Fire, mass graves filled with the bones of the last defenders, a geological memory of the cataclysm. Hannibal's strategic vision that Rome could be defeated by breaking its system of alliances was ultimately proven right, but not in his lifetime. The social war, centuries later, saw Rome's Italian allies rise in a bloody revolt for the very citizenship Hannibal had offered them. The destruction of Carthage created a template for Roman imperial policy for centuries to come. The concept of debillatio, the complete subjugation and dissolution of a hostile state, was perfected here. It was a warning to all who would oppose Rome. Resistance could mean extinction. Yet, in their effort to erase Carthage, the Romans ensured its immortality. By making it the ultimate example of their power, they guaranteed that its name, its story, and the name of Hannibal would be studied, remembered, and mourned for as long as Rome itself was remembered. The final lesson of Carthage is not about military tactics or political strategy. It is a lesson about the darkness that resides in the heart of victory, and the light that can persist in the heart of defeat. It is about the price of survival and the often higher price of triumph. And so, the wind that blows across the Bay of Tunis carries two memories, the scent of salt and the ghost of smoke. It whispers of merchants and elephants, of a general's oath and his city's dying breath, a timeless echo of the fall of nations. The plunder from Carthage did not just fill Roman coffers. It flooded the city's soul. The sheer scale of wealth, tons of silver, priceless art, endless slaves shattered the old Roman concept of virtue. A new era of avarice and spectacle was born from Carthaginian ashes. In the centuries that followed, Roman poets and philosophers would look back at the Punic Wars as a watershed. They saw in the fall of Carthage the moment their republic lost its innocence, the point where external threats were replaced by internal rot. The enemy without was gone. The enemy within had been fed. The memory of Hannibal's near victory became a tool in Roman politics. For populists, he was a symbol of what a single brilliant leader could achieve against a stagnant aristocracy. For conservatives, he was the ultimate warning against empowering any individual too greatly. Across the Mediterranean, the story of Carthage was told differently. In Greek histories, there was often a note of sympathy, a recognition of a fellow maritime civilization brought low by the relentless, land-based power of Rome. They saw their own potential fate reflected in the burning harbor. The logistical marvel of Hannibal's campaign became the stuff of legend. The Alpine crossing was seen not just as a military feat, but as an act of sheer human will against nature itself. It entered the realm of the epic, a journey to rival that of Odysseus. For the enslaved Carthaginians marched in chains through Rome. Their world had ended twice, first in fire and steel, and now in the humiliation of the triumph. They became the invisible foundation of the new Roman order, their labor building the monuments that celebrated their own destruction. The Roman province of Africa was established on Carthage's former lands. It became the breadbasket of the empire, its fertile fields now feeding the legions and the mob of Rome. The land that had sustained the Barcids now ensured their destroyers' survival. In the silent corridors of power, a new fear took root in Rome, the fear of another Hannibal. This paranoia dictated foreign policy for generations, leading to preemptive wars and the ruthless suppression of any rising power that displayed a hint of similar ambition or genius. The intellectual loss was incalculable. The great library of Carthage, if it existed, was lost to the flames. Centuries of astronomical observations, geographical records, and philosophical treatises unique to the Punic world turned to smoke, a silent holocaust of knowledge. And so, the story ossified. Carthage became a byword for treachery, its name a curse. For over 2,000 years, the Roman version stood largely unchallenged, a testament to the power of the victor, not only to write history, but to engrave it in stone and blood. Yet, the earth holds secrets deeper than empires. In the Tophet of Carthage, the sacred precinct, archaeologists found small buried urns. They contained the cremated remains of children, not as simple propaganda claimed, but as complex offerings, speaking of a faith so profound, it was willing to sacrifice its future to the gods. The language of Carthage, Punic, did not die instantly. It persisted in rural areas, in legal documents, in the place names that dot the North African coast to this day. It was a ghost tongue, lingering on the lips of people who now called themselves Romans. The Barcid bloodline did not end with Hannibal. Through his sisters, it is believed his lineage may have filtered into the Numidian royal families, and from there, into the very fabric of North African history, a final, ironic twist in the tale of genetic legacy. In the 2nd century A.D., the Roman Emperor Septimius Severus, born in Leptis Magna, in a heavily Punic-speaking region, ascended the throne. A man of African origin now ruled the empire that had destroyed his cultural ancestor. The past was never truly dead. The concept of Hannibal's revenge took a different form. As Rome's political center shifted east to Constantinople, the Western Empire withered. The African province, once Rome's granary, was lost to Vandals, a Germanic tribe that used Carthage as its capital for a century. Through the Arab conquests, the site of Carthage faded into obscurity, its stones quarried for new cities like Tunis. The great city became a forgotten name in a new world, its memory kept alive not by conquerors, but by scholars in Baghdad and Constantinople preserving ancient texts. The Enlightenment and the Romantic era rediscovered Hannibal. He was reborn as a romantic hero, a sublime figure struggling against the machinations of fate and a corrupt republic. His story resonated with a Europe fascinated by doomed genius and revolutionary fervor. In the 20th century, the figure of Hannibal was adopted by new African nations as a symbol of pre-colonial resistance to European imperialism. He was reclaimed as an African hero who had challenged and nearly toppled the greatest power of the ancient Western world. The archaeological site of Carthage is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The same stones that witnessed the genocide are now protected by the international community as a treasure of all humanity. The place of cursing has become a place of shared, if sorrowful, heritage. And so the wheel turns. The memory of Carthage is no longer owned by Rome, nor by any single nation. It belongs to history itself, a cautionary tale, a story of brilliance and hubris, a ghost that asks us what we choose to remember and what we are doomed to repeat. The Roman legionary who scrawled a graffito of a phallus on a Carthaginian wall, the merchant who melted down a Baal statue for coin, the slave who forgot their mother tongue, these small, silent acts completed the destruction that fire and sword began. Erasure is a process, not an event. Yet, in the Vatican museums today, there rests a beautiful mosaic of doves drinking from a golden bowl, signed by the artist Sosus of Pergamon. It was a copy of a lost Carthaginian original. The victor, in a moment of unconscious homage, preserved a fragment of the beauty they extinguished. The psychological wound Rome inflicted on itself never fully healed. The phrase Hannibal ante portas, Hannibal is at the gates, became a perpetual proverb for existential panic. Long after his death, he remained the ultimate specter of crisis, a ghost they had created and could not exorcise. Modern military academies still teach Cannae as the perfect battle of annihilation. But the lesson has evolved. It is no longer just about tactics. It is about the dangers of overwhelming success, the point where victory becomes so complete it creates a strategic vacuum. The DNA of modern Tunisia is a palimpsest. Berber, Punic, Roman, Vandal, Byzantine, Arab, Ottoman, French, all are layers in its genetic code. The Carthaginian strand is the foundational layer, the deepest whisper in the blood of the land. In the world of finance, the story of Carthage serves as a dark allegory. A once dominant power, overly reliant on a single strategy, its navy and trade, was outmaneuvered by a more adaptable, relentless competitor. A warning against inflexibility in any empire, commercial or political. The silence of the Carthaginian perspective is itself a historical fact of profound importance. We hear their story only through the screams of their dying city and the boasts of their enemies. This absence is a monument to the millions of voices forever lost to the fire. Perhaps the most enduring legacy is the question of what if. What if Hannibal had marched on Rome after Cannae? What if Carthage had sent him the reinforcements he begged for? This alternate history haunts the imagination, a testament to how close the world came to being utterly different. The salt sown into the earth was a powerful curse, but it was also a confession. It revealed a deep superstitious fear that the spirit of the place was so potent, so resilient, that only a magical act could keep it from rising again. They feared the very soil remembered. And so we are left not with answers, but with the echo of a question that Carthage poses to every civilization. At the peak of your power, who is the boy in the temple, swearing an oath against you? And what mountains will he cross to see it fulfilled? The war galleys of Carthage, once the masters of the inland sea, rotted on the seabed or were broken apart by Roman axes. Their unique design, the quinquereme, a floating fortress of oars and bronze, faded from memory, a lost technology of a vanquished sea power. For the common Roman soldier who survived the siege, the memory was not of strategy, but of stench. The smell of a city dying of thirst and disease, the miasma of burning bodies and hope, clung to their tunics long after they returned home, a sensory scar. In the realm of law, Rome's victory established a brutal precedent, that a treaty could be a weapon, its clauses designed not for peace, but to create a pretext for final war. The concept of supreme emergency was born here, justifying any breach of faith. The agricultural treatises of the Carthaginian sage Mago were, by Senate decree, translated into Latin. His wisdom on cultivating olives and vines was preserved, even as the culture that produced him was erased. The body was killed, but the useful knowledge was harvested. The children of Carthage who survived the sack grew up speaking Latin, worshipping Roman gods, and believing the stories of their own ancestors' monstrousness. The most complete conquest is when the conquered learn to hate their own past. The harbor, the heart of Carthaginian power, was not just filled with rubble. It was rendered ritually impure. No Roman ship would dock there for generations. It was a place of ghosts, its circular design, a cursed geometry in the Roman mind. For the philosophers of the Stoic school, Hannibal became an example of a different kind of failure, the failure of a man to master his own success. His inability to leverage his victories into a lasting peace was a lesson in the limits of military genius without wisdom. The very word Punic entered the English language, a direct linguistic fossil from this conflict. It carries the ancient Roman bias within it, forever associating Carthage with treachery, a prejudice encoded in vocabulary itself. In the end, the story of Carthage is the story of a reflection. Rome, in destroying its mirror image, its commercial, naval rival, was also trying to destroy the part of itself that was mercantile, pragmatic, and fluid. They chose to be the rigid, land-based empire of the sword, and in doing so, set a course for their own, much later fall. And so the wind carries two kinds of dust, the ash of Carthage and the topsoil of its fields, now blown across the sea. One speaks of an ending, the other of a beginning that fed an empire. Both are the same substance, transformed by fire and time. In the quiet of museums, the coins of Carthage tell a silent story. The proud horse, the palm tree, the profile of a goddess, these symbols outlive the stake that minted them. They are now orphans of history, their value transformed from commerce to contemplation. The Roman playwright Plautus wrote comedies filled with caricatured Carthaginian merchants, speaking in a broken, comic Latin. This was the final insult, not just to be destroyed, but to be rendered a punchline, a stock character of greed in the culture of your conquerors. Yet, in a hidden corner of the Roman world, a different memory persisted. A family heirloom, a Carthaginian amulet against the evil eye, passed down through generations of a Roman family who had no idea of its origin, still offering its silent, ancient protection. The climate itself may have been an unwitting actor. Some historians whisper of a prolonged drought weakening Carthage's agricultural base in its final decades, making it less resilient to the Roman stranglehold. The gods of rain, it seems, had also turned their backs. The dream of Hannibal did not die at Zama. It flickered in the hearts of every subsequent rebel who dared to challenge Rome. Spartacus, Vercingetorix, Arminius each, in their own way, walked in the long shadow of the man who proved the giant could be made to bleed. The last free breath of Carthage was not a king's decree or a general's order. It was the final, choked prayer of a mother in a burning house, a whisper to her gods in a language that would soon be forbidden. The true end of a people is the death of their prayers. For the archaeologist, the stratum of destruction is a clean, dark line in the soil, a datable moment of absolute violence. But below it lies the vibrant color of life, and above it, the slow, gray layers of forgetting. The earth remembers the cataclysm as a single, terrible page. The story of Carthage is a warning against the monopoly of narrative. When only one side tells the story, truth becomes a casualty. The recovery of Carthage is therefore an act of justice, not for the living, but for the dead who can no longer speak. And what of the oath? It was a seed planted in hatred, watered with blood, that grew into a tree of fire, whose shadow consumed the planter. Vengeance is a debt that, when paid in full, often bankrupts the soul of the creditor. So we listen. To the silence between the notes, to the emptiness where a city once stood. In that quiet, we hear not just the fall of Carthage, but the fragile nature of our own walls, our own harbors, our own certainties. All are built on the same trembling earth. The line between history and myth has blurred. Hannibal is no longer just a man. He is an idea. The idea that a single will can defy the inevitable, that geography is a suggestion, that numbers are a puzzle to be solved. He is the human spirit, raging against the machine of fate. Carthage, in its death, achieved a strange immortality. It became the standard for all lost cities, the ultimate what was here before. Its name is a synonym for a civilization so completely erased that its existence feels more like a rumor than a fact. The conflict forged the Roman imperial character ruthless, pragmatic, and enduring. The Rome that would rule for centuries was tempered in the fires of the Punic Wars. In trying to destroy Rome, Hannibal inadvertently helped create its most powerful version. Perhaps the most poignant legacy is not in books or stones, but in the simple, stubborn resilience of the fig and the olive tree. Their roots, deep in Carthaginian soil, have outlasted empires. Their fruit, a timeless offering from a land that remembers all its children. We are left with a choice of ghosts. The ghost of Hannibal, forever marching. The ghost of Cato, forever demanding destruction. Or the ghost of the city itself, a phantom of trade and tolerance, asking only what might have been. The story ends as it began, with the sea. The same Mediterranean that carried Carthaginian merchants to tin islands in African shores now laps gently on a tourist beach. The water holds no memory, no grudge. It witnessed everything and says nothing. So let the final word be not of fire, but of a single small discovery. A child's toy, a terracotta horse, found in the rubble of a Carthaginian home. A simple object of play, untouched by the grand narratives of empire and oath, a testament to the ordinary life that was the true cost. The fall of nations is not a single thunderous crash. It is the cumulative silence of a million such small endings, a song unsung, a recipe forgotten, a lullaby lost to time. It is the death of a million tiny, beautiful particulars. Hannibal versus Rome, Carthage versus the Republic. It was more than a war. It was a dialogue of violence that asked the oldest question. Does the world belong to the builder of walls or the crosser of mountains? The answer, it seems, is written in ash and memory. The fire is out. The salt has dissolved in the rain. The story is told. Now only the quiet remains. A space for sleep, for dreams, where the ghosts of empires can finally rest, and we are left with the echo and the warning carried on the night wind.